The following is a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. For more information, please visit our website at dallasgenealogy.org.
Okay, we're going to start the German Genealogy Group SIG meeting of the Dallas Genealogy Society. And I'm here along with my co-leader, Bernard Meisner, and he's kind of waving his hand there if you can see his video. You can get to our page. I'm going to do this a little bit differently this time. I'm going to talk about visually because some people are more visual. So if you go to dallasgenealogy.com and you look under events and special interest groups, I couldn't get all on one screen, so I had to do two screens here. So events, special interest groups, and then you'll see the German genealogy group. So if you click on that, that's probably how you got here, or you could have clicked on the link that I had sent out an email or Facebook. But that's how you get to our webpage. And on our webpage, come on. All right, now we can click down. Come on. There we go. On our webpage, you will find recordings of past meetings, and this meeting will be recorded and will be put on this webpage as well. And our upcoming meetings will always be located here with the topics. So I just wanted to kind of make sure everybody knew where everything was. And our Facebook group, which many of you are probably members of, is the German Genealogy Group of North Texas. And I also gave the exact link here on the page if you prefer to do it that way. Facebook.com/groups/DGSGGG. There are a few questions you have to answer. If you don't answer the questions, at least one of the questions, we probably won't let you in because we're just trying to make sure people are, are German related, basically. All right. There's a lot of upcoming presentations across the United States. We kind of watch them and put them on our Facebook page. This is one that may be of interest to some of you. It's Find Your Roots in Naturalization Records. And it's presented by the Genealogy Society of Pennsylvania on the 18th of November. And it is 6 p.m. our time, Central Time. And I know this link is difficult to copy down, but if you go to our Facebook page, you'll see this. If you scroll down, you can see the advertisement for this, and you'll find the link there as well. Okay. The Germanic Genealogy Society in Minnesota. This is one of the main genealogy societies for German genealogy. And they're having a meeting December 9th that is more ethnic Germany and Romania and Hungary. Some of you may be interested in that. If you go to ggsmn.org, that will help you navigate to this website and to all the other presentations that they have. Now, sometimes the handouts are only available to members, but you can usually watch the presentation live for free. So just be aware of that. Legacy Family Tree webinars, they have some on Germany, and they have one coming up again on immigrants, uncovering immigrant origins through cluster research, which is a little bit different. And you can get to them at familytreewebinars.com. Again, the handouts are for members only, but you can watch the video sometimes for a short period of time after the presentation as well, but you need to check that out if you're interested in any of these presentations. There may be more, but we'll post on Facebook, ones that are coming up. A lot of records are being updated online. Family Search is continuing to update their German records. So we have some Prussia Saxony records being updated right now by them. So if you're interested in that region, go check that out. Archeon.de, of course, is for Lutheran church records in German. And They started to do Northern Germany, which is so exciting for me. I'm sorry. I've been waiting for Northern Germany. And so keep your eye out if you have some Northern German. The churches are starting to go online. You can look at the list of churches for free. You can do a search on a church town name for free. You can also get their email, which lists, they send out an email that talks about what's they're just putting online. So this is an example from an October email that I put up here. So you can always kind of keep up with what's going on and join when you need to join. Okay, so Bernard, are you ready for the poll? We're going to do a quick poll here.
And it says no polls or quizzes created.
Okay, they didn't create one. Well, never mind then. I guess we won't be doing that. We have a new webmaster, unfortunately, and we probably didn't, he didn't set up the default polls. So unfortunately, we usually try to determine how many people are members of the Dallas Genealogy Society just because we're a SIG from that society. But we'll skip that for now, and I'll make a note to talk to the webmaster. Okay, so upcoming meetings. For some reason, the main Dallas Genealogy Society meeting, they didn't want to hold it on January 1st. I really can't understand why they wouldn't want to hold a meeting on January 1st. But anyway, so they bumped us down. So we are no longer at 10:30 in the morning on January 8th. We're now at 1:30 in the afternoon on January 8th. And so unfortunately, our speaker couldn't do that time. So we're working on replacing the speaker for January. In March, we're going to have Teresa Burns, who is a translator in Germany. She'll be zooming in from Germany, hopefully. And on May, we're going to have Susan Kaufman from the Clayton Library. And we'll have more information on these presentations on our website and on Facebook. And then, of course, those on our email list will also get the information. If you want to join our email list, you can go to our website and you can email ggg@dallasgenealogy.com, I think, and or .org, I don't remember, .com, I think. And it will send an email and say in the email you'd like to join our email lists for upcoming presentations, okay? So now I'm going to introduce Garry. Garry is a past president of the New York chapter of Palatines America, or Palatines, or however you want to pronounce it. Everybody pronounces it differently, I think. And we're going to talk a little bit about the immigration of the Palatines from the Rhine Valley to the Hudson Valley, which actually impacts a lot of the Palatines. So I'm going to stop sharing now and let Garry share here. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm actually very excited about giving this talk because it got me to really formalize a lot of things that I knew and discover some things that I didn't know, or at least at a deeper, a greater depth than I had before. Let me just go here. Just as a quick introduction to our organization, we're Palatines America. This is, by the way, a one-page presentation that one of the board members of the IGGP proposed, and so he actually asked me to supply the information. So we got to be one of the first ones just last week to do this. But it's a nice one-page overview of any organization. So we have 6 chapters based on state: Colorado, Indiana, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Now, and then down in the lower left corner, you see that we have German-speaking ancestors from everywhere. And one of the obvious misleading aspects of the name Palatines America is that everyone assumes that everyone who's a member has Palatine ancestry, which is not the case. the organization was founded in Ohio by people with New York Palatine ancestry. And so they gave it the name back in 1975, and it caused all sorts of problems. It works perfectly for me, being a New York Palatine, but for many of the others whose ancestors came later on, it becomes a problem explaining over and over again, no, we're not all Palatines, and we're not all from the 1700s. And then in the upper right corner, I think Anne has this so you can look at it more closely. Some of the things that we do, we have our national conference coming up in Colorado in June. We skipped our 2020 conference, which would have been very exciting. It would have been in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we were really looking forward to that, and that fell apart, of course, with COVID. Does anyone have any questions about that at all, about PalAm? We do have a lot of databases, by the way. We didn't include that here. We have to kind of build that in next time, the next version, but we do have a lot of really valuable databases. Now let me bring up the presentation. Okay, and I can't.
Well, he's doing that. By the way, the handouts are on our website, so where you click to join the meeting. So please go and grab them there.
Okay. All right. So there were already Germans who had come in little bits and pieces to New York City. In fact, interestingly, many of the Dutch who came to New York colony or New York province in the 1600s were actually Germans who just came with the Dutch. And actually a lot of Norwegians too, which is only now being fully discovered. A lot of the Dutch were not Dutch, is what it comes down to. And of course, there were Germans in Pennsylvania at this point because of the invitation from William Penn to bring them into the Philadelphia port. But New York at this point had only a handful of Germans between New York City and maybe a couple up in the Albany area. And this turned out to be, just mention this turned out to be the largest single immigration to the colonies of North America in the entire colonial period. Now, I want to go back a bit, about 100 years, and talk about what was going on prior to this group leaving. And you'll find that there were many reasons, many very serious reasons for a lot of the people to want to come here. And in fact, I just made another side note. Many of the people from that area emigrated to Russia and to Eastern Europe at this very same time. This was an area that really was suffering greatly, and people wanted out if they had an opportunity. So the first war was the 30 Years' War, 1618. So almost exactly 100 years prior to this group leaving, to 1648. And as it says, considered one of the most destructive wars in European history. I mean, you look at the fact that deaths went between 4.5 to 8 million in the estimate, which is just a massive number of people in a much smaller population in Europe at that time. And some of the areas of Germany experienced population declines of over 50%. I mean, that is just staggering, that either through death or people just moving somewhere, just getting out of the way. And this is the first of a group of wars that always involved France. And France was trying to expand its territory. There were also conflicts between the Habsburgs and Austria, the Spanish nobility, the Swedes, and there were in some of the pieces of the former German Empire. And one of the most popular battlefields, unfortunately, was the Rhineland. And these people were just caught in the crossfire of all this, and this beginning with the 30 Years' War and continuing on through the other wars. And of course, they had France right over the border, the whole Alsace-Lorraine area, it's always going back and forth between France and Germany. And so they were just really, really ready victims to all of this. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen pictures of the places like Heidelberg or Stuttgart, where the French army came through and just annihilated the towns and destroyed castles. I've seen the castle in Heidelberg, and it's hard to comprehend how they broke through this wall that's several feet thick, but they did that. And so, as I said, these people, their predecessors, their ancestors, went through a terrible time up to this point. And this is the depopulation map that resulted from the 30 Years' War. And these dark areas represent population declines of over 66%. And one of them is right here, which is the area of interest, right here in the Rhine Valley, and then leading down into the Danube Valley and down toward Munich. So this, you can imagine, 66% of the population is gone, either through death or simply leaving. And what happened here was some villages simply got up and walked away. They went into some other part of what we now call Germany, and some of them never returned. The village was just left completely as a ghost town, in effect. In some cases, the village, after things settled down after 1648, the whole village came back, and they would actually have the church records brought back. Others, as I said, never came back. And one of the big impacts of this during this particular war was because this area was so devoid of people, the nobility tried to encourage other people to move there. And so there was this very large migration into that area following the 30 Years' War from all over Germany, as well as from Switzerland. A lot of people from Switzerland moved up into this area because, again, it was all vacant. It was very fertile farmland. It's of course, this is the area where, to this day, a lot of German wines are produced in this area. So it was very good for wine growing and other agriculture. And also people even came up from Italy. I presume, I don't know this, but for instance, my name Finkell is actually a Bavarian name. And so I assume, but I don't know this, that my ancestors may have come into this area in the mid-1600s from Bavaria. That's not necessarily the case. It could have happened at an earlier point, but it's very possible that they did come into that area at this point. You can see other areas were devastated as well, but this area, of course, is the one that's of most interest, to me. And but the devastation was just beyond imagination. So in the repopulation of the returning individuals and entire villages, the French Huguenots, the French Protestant Huguenots, also, because life was so difficult for them in France at this point, they also came in to the Palatine area. Swiss Mennonites, as I mentioned, and others from Switzerland as well, and then individuals from other German states. Now, one thing I wanted to mention about the French Huguenots, there are two towns in New York State. One is called New Rochelle, and the other is called New Paltz. And ironically, they're both settled by Huguenots in the 1600s, late 1600s. And ironically, the German word for Palatine is Pfalz, P-F-A-L-Z. And New Paltz is named after New Pfalz, was actually settled by French Huguenots who had first gone and settled in the Palatine area and then came to New York at an earlier point. Now, the next big war was the 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697, called the War of the Grand Alliance or the War of the League of Augsburg. And once again, where was one of the top battlefields but the Rhineland? And so again, you got now another 9 years of fighting. These people had repopulated, so now you've got a potentially new group of people being exposed to warfare for the first time if they'd come out of Switzerland or say Bavaria or other parts of Germany. They had not experienced the 30 Years' War. Now they're experiencing war at this point. And again, France is involved right over the border from the German states. Then at the time that they were coming here, the War of Spanish Succession was going on. So they came, this group comes here in around the 17, well, they leave around 1708, 1709. So they're right in the middle of another war. This is called the War of the Grand Alliance, or the War of the League of Augsburg. So, emigration. First of all, I think it's important to know when we talk about coming from Germany or even coming from the Rhineland in the 1700s, this is what we're talking about. This whole area right here, which is just a hodgepodge of little kingdoms, principalities. There is no Germany in any way, shape, or form at this stage of history. Whereas you see France is a single entity, and some of these other countries have a real substance in terms of size. This southwestern part of Germany especially is just a political chaos almost. And not only do you have these little tiny kingdoms, but often you have something like Bavaria over here, if you look at the colors, and I'm partially colorblind, so I'm not going to even attempt to point this out. But if you look at the colors, Bavaria owns land over here. So you have little parts over here, like the Bavarian Palatinate, that are completely disconnected from the main body of Bavaria, and yet the leaders of Bavaria are the leaders of these other areas in the Rhineland. And it's true of some of the other larger states, that own property in the Rhineland, even though they're very far away and there's no contiguous connection whatsoever. Okay, now this is Germany now, so we're going to jump ahead. Meanwhile, there's a lot went on in between these two maps in terms of consolidation of territories and so on. And so these are the current German states, and we're going to be talking about this area right down here. And I close in more closely. So you got Hesse, and like I said, it took a lot of work to get from that mess that you saw in the 1700s up to now. So even Hesse modern Hesse is really made up of three different components that were separate at one point. The Rhineland Pfalz, the Rhineland Palatinate is the Rhineland, and then the Pfalz is something else. And even the Pfalz was not even all connected to itself. The Palatine was really more of a political entity itself, because the elector Palatine was one of the people who voted on the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire that existed, to the extent it existed at that time. And that actually represented pieces that were not connected to each other. And now the Saarland, now Baden-Württemberg, that until somewhat recently, there was the state of Baden and there was the state of Württemberg. Now, in modern Germany, they are connected to each other. And so one thing I'm going to mention this a little later, these people that see themselves exactly as Germans, they belong to different political entities. They had different dialects. There were a lot of things that would cause them to not necessarily connect with each other, at least not that closely. And the sense of being a German, to a great extent, did not exist among these people. Okay, so why did they leave? Okay, I've already talked about the warfare that just took on such devastating impact in the 30 Years' War, but just continued after that. Poverty. Well, that's part of the result of that was poverty. These people were extremely poor. There was very little going on. Not only were their lives just disrupted by the warfare, but the farmlands were just ripped apart from armies moving back and forth. And another thing that contributed was the brutal winter in 1708 to 1709. They were in the midst of what has been called the Little Ice Age. It goes back into the 1600s. It reached its low point, I think, around the 1680s, 1690s, when it was just a long period of terribly cold weather. So the crop yields in all these years was much lower than it would have been in a normal climate. But this particular winter was even worse than previous ones. They would talk about the fact that birds would fall out of the sky dead, that if you spit, it would be ice before it hit the ground. But the real impact in terms of their lives was that it was so cold, it destroyed, actually froze and cracked the apple trees, all the fruit trees. It destroyed the vines for growing grapes. So this just added to the misery. And so the whole situation was just horrible for these people. They had nothing to look forward to. They were barely surviving. And then finally, the enticements to come to the English colonies, I'll be talking about that in a little while, that there was a real, not only this push, which was strong enough, but a real pull to encourage people from this area to leave and to come to the English colonies in North America. Now, two key people in all this are Reverend Joshua Kocherthal, who was a Lutheran pastor who came from Bavaria and then settled in the Rhineland, and Queen Anne of England. Now, Reverend Kocherthal was living this miserable life with everyone, and somehow became aware, and we don't know, there's a lot that we don't know about the dynamics of this period, but somehow became aware that the English had an interest in populating their colonies. At this point in English history, fewer and fewer people were deciding to come to North America. In other words, the population in the English colonies at this point was somewhat stable. You didn't have like large numbers of Englishmen going there as you might have had in the past. The Dutch, of course, were settled. They were not, no longer coming here. There might be like some Swedes in Delaware, but nothing of substance. So he became aware that the English had a real interest in populating North America. Of course, William Penn was probably the only one at that point who was aggressively doing anything about it. So he took this group of 53 Palatines, and they came to New York. This voyage lasted about 4 months. Apparently, the voyage was not was uneventful. I'm sure it was eventful, but relatively uneventful in terms of catastrophe or anything like that. So they spent the winter in New York City, which of course was not the New York City of today, relatively low population. They settled where Newburgh is right now, which is just up the Hudson River, probably about 50 miles north of New York City. And they formed the first German Lutheran congregation in the colony of New York. Now, one thing, and I want to say this too, because the Palatines, I just often automatically know this, but it's not obvious. They were called Palatines by the English. The Palatinate was a specific part of this area. It was probably the most well-known to the English. And so they called all these Germans Palatines, when in fact they were not. They were from that whole Rhineland area. So they might be Hessians, they might be Badeners or Württembergers, but they were all lumped together with the single term Palatines by the English and by the people in North America, the colonists in North America. Now, I mentioned the pull. Throughout the Rhineland, this little book went around And this is the cover. This is what it said. It says, as you can see at the top, a complete and detailed report of the renowned district of Carolina located in English America. This was distributed throughout the Rhineland, and Carolina, of course, if you're living in the Rhineland, you have no idea what North America is at all. It's all belongs to the English. And so for some reason, the name Carolina stood to represent all of the English colonies in North America. I'm not sure why. I guess it was a very appealing place. And Bernard, I know, is there. So it's they use the word Carolina almost to stand for America at this point within Germany. This pamphlet was distributed, as I said, throughout the Rhineland, and the cover page had some gold on it. Some of the letters were gold, the edge was gold. It has a picture in the inside of Queen Anne, and it talked about Queen Anne invites her German cousins to settle in her colonies in North America. There's a lot of discussion as to who actually produced this thing. It gave the impression that the English government did. It doesn't appear that that's the case. Many people think Kocherthal produced it. In any case, it had an incredible impact on these people. That here is an opportunity maybe to get out of their current situation and go to a much better environment. It was called the Golden Book, and everyone knew about it. And this was the pull I mentioned to go along with the push of everything else that was going on in their own world. So regardless of who produced it, it did have an impact. So people started on their own, based on this book, sailing up the Rhine River. You know, the Rhine flows essentially north, and so to go down the rivers to go up in another perspective. And they arrived in Rotterdam, and they started arriving by the thousands. There is an estimate that maybe 15,000 people came down into Rotterdam. The Dutch had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what to do with these people. They got the message that, oh, we're all going to the English colonies. So there was a whole big, amount of conflict between the Dutch and the English, like, what is happening here? We don't want these people here, get them out of here somehow. And so the English, meanwhile, who were really completely unprepared for something like this, tried to get them over to England. They really knew that they were way beyond their ability to handle all of this. So they started basically telling people to go back. One of the things that they used as a deciding point was whether you're a Catholic or not. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but they did not want Catholics. They didn't want to be bringing Catholics to their colonies in North America. It also gave them some sort of basis of, rejecting some of these people. But even if we were dealing with just with the Protestants, the Lutherans, and the Reformed church members, it still was overwhelming. And they just at some point said, no more, we cannot take any more. So they moved thousands of people to London. And they go to Blackheath. And they set up tent cities in Blackheath. And this is a little illustration from the time of the Palatine settlements in Blackheath. And they became a very big point of interest to the people of London. People would actually come, like in large numbers, to just look at these Palatines and just sort of study them almost as like very, unique, exotic people. But meanwhile, they're living in pretty tough conditions even here. Now, I want to say these people had one problem after another. They left from one bad situation. Now they're in a kind of a different bad situation. And here's another illustration. And the English they didn't ever, it seemed like they never used the word Palatine without the word poor. They called them the poor Palatines. And there was a lot of charity. I mean, the churches in the London area, tried to provide food and other things for these people. They really did have a real compassion for them and tried to help them as much as they could. As time went on, however, some of the poor people in London are saying, hey, why are you taking care of these foreigners? You're not taking care of us. And so things started to get a little more tense in terms of providing for these people in this tent city. And so they were both a subject of interest, they're a subject of compassion, and they're a subject of some debate and conflict as well. So the Queen's plans. So she wanted to create, Queen Anne wanted to create a Protestant presence among Irish Catholics. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. And she also wanted to block French Catholics in Canada from moving down into New York. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And producing pitch for naval vessels. In other words, these are the three reasons that she wanted to take advantage of having these people, these Palatines among them. I want to mention that at the time of Queen Anne, religion was a very big deal. They were already in the process, in the conflict between the Catholic Church and the Anglican, the Protestant Church, in terms of the very ruling of England, was still a huge matter, because Queen Anne's father, James, was a Catholic. There was still a very, very clear struggle between the different religious groups as to who was actually going to rule England. So they were hypersensitive about religious issues. That was no longer the case in the Rhineland. It appears that Catholics, Lutherans, Reformed had really settled into their positions, and there was very little conflict. In many cases, there'd be one church, and the different groups would take turns on Sunday using the church for their own services. And people, Catholics were intermarried with Lutherans and Reformed. And so you're dealing with very different views of religion at this point between the two groups. Meanwhile, the English presented the Palatines on one level as our suffering, Protestant brethren. It wasn't exactly true. As I said, among themselves, there was very little conflict. You could say, well, the French Catholics were fighting, in this area, but the German Catholics didn't do any better than the German Protestants in terms of facing the Catholic French army. So, but that's one of the ways that the English nobility and rulers tried to sort of sell this idea, was that we're helping these people who are fellow, Protestants suffering religious persecution. And so what happened was, right here, this is a very, very little known piece of history. Was this idea of Germans settling in Ireland. So they have thousands of these Palatines. They really don't have the ships to get them to North America. They want to do something with them. So they send some of them to a couple of thousand of them to Ireland. And right down here in Ireland, this area, primarily in Limerick, but also Tipperary and Kerry, they have at this point, England rules Ireland. They often have English lords who own all the properties in this area. But with the Irish Catholics, being the farmers and people living in the villages, so they bring around 3,000 or so Germans into this area right down here, and they actually successfully settle here. They're farmers also. The Germans had much more sophisticated farming methods, there was not the conflict, the Catholic Protestant conflict that you see later on in Northern Ireland. They basically settled in as neighbors. The one group is speaking German. They happen to be Protestants, and the local native Irish Catholics don't seem to conflict with each other at all. And so to this day, there are Irish Palatines, and they have a joke that they speak with a brogue, but they have sauerkraut for dinner. And I'll just get into some little ways. There's actually an Irish Palatine special interest group of the Ontario Genealogical Society. And our New York chapter of Palatines America has a lot of interaction with them. There's a whole fascinating story behind with them. They became very influenced by the Wesleys, and many of them became Methodists. And the actual first Methodist church in North America was founded in New York City around the 1760s by Irish Palatines. And they ended up being loyalists and ended up in Canada and started the first Methodist church in Canada. And then in the 1800s, many people came from this area and they moved directly to Canada. So there are a lot of Irish Palatine descendants in Canada now, primarily in Ontario. Okay, so finally, the British are able to get some ships together to bring these people to America. So 4,000 Palatines board 11 ships on Christmas Day in 1709. They sat on those ships, it seems, for a month before they actually set sail. Unlike that first group that seemed to have had no trouble coming across the sea, about 700 of these Palatines died en route to New York. One ship foundered off near Long Island, off the east coast of Long Island, and there was loss of life there. So you had, by the time they arrived, you had children without parents, you had parents who lost their children, and you had entire families in some cases lost. So they arrive in New York City in July of 1710. Now, they arrived at first and they land at what was called Nutting Island, that is now Governor's Island. They actually, it was a point of terror for the people of New York City. The population in New York City at that time wasn't all that large, but the idea of 3,000 people, if they brought them into New York City, would just overwhelm the city. So they had not intended to do that, and so it's not like that was the plan, but the people of New York City were very much afraid that that might happen. So they so now we're talking about the arrival in the Hudson Valley, and then later on and I'll talk about this, the movement to the Skyharry and Mohawk valleys. So here's a map of the time with the Hudson River. So you've got New York City down here at the bottom. Here's Newburgh, where the first group settled. And then we come up here to Rhinebeck and Kingston, and they actually settled these people just above that area in what's called East Camp right here and West Camp over here. So they essentially just split the team into two pieces, like roughly 1,500 goes to East Camp, and the other 1,500 go over to West Camp. They're directly across the river from each other. They actually, actually have little signs there where they initially landed. And as I said, this is the largest single immigration to North America during the colonial period. Now you've got East Camp essentially became what's called Germantown now, and then West Camp became essentially what's called Saugerties now. And Rhinebeck's also, some of these people ended up in Rhinebeck. And now this is actually, they created little settlements, little villages, almost like they would have in Germany. These are the names of the villages. Later on, these are all English names, of course. Queensbury, Ansbury, Queen Anne. I don't know the reason for all these, Queen Elizabeth here, of course. And then Georgetown for King George. Hunterstown, the English governor at the time was Governor Hunter, and he was tasked with settling these people, which was no easy thing because this was all forest. This was not farmland. And many of the people were actually not farmers. Some of them were tradespeople. You had tailors. You also had vine dressers because of the wine growing area. And you were tasking them with basically clearing forest, which is not something they were familiar with at all because they're dealing with settled farmland in Germany. And things were very bad here. In the first couple of years, many people just basically starved to death. They were eating bark off trees. They were boiling grass. They were eating leaves. And many people died in this first couple of years. And Hunter had limited resources to help them. So in Germantown, this is the sign at the Palatine Park. It says in memory of the 1,484 refugees from the Rhineland who settled in the East Camp during this autumn of 1710. And East Camp became Germantown. Here's the site of the first Lutheran church. So they immediately built a church, erected in 1710, the very time that they arrived. And they also built a school very quickly. So in 1711, they actually built the first school. So you can kind of see these people are farmers, but nonetheless, building a church is number one priority, and building a school is pretty close to number two. I mean, obviously, trying to survive is really number one. This is a plaque in West Camp near the church that Pastor Cokerthal pastored. And this is a list right here of all the people who settled in the two camps, East Camp and West Camp. There's a similar plaque over in Germantown that just has the East Camp settlers. My family, my Finkell family, were with the group that settled in East Camp or Germantown. One important thing to know, and I've already talked about it, is that these people were coming from essentially different German states. They had different dialects, they had different senses of loyalty, and now they're all sort of thrown in together. And they had to obviously work together. And so ironically, this book by Philip Otterness came out, I think, in 2008 or thereabouts. And he's a professor, I think, down in the Carolinas. And he has this whole concept that the first people who saw themselves as, quote, Germans were actually this group of people, because their one common denominator was that they were all essentially speaking the same language, although with many dialects, and that they all came from the same area, and that they were Germans. That was the common denominator. And it's a really fascinating book, because he said the idea of being a German existed in the Hudson Valley and the Mohawk Valley of New York before it existed in Germany itself. Now, this is a map that shows you not only this was the first segment I showed you down here, and then this is the Mohawk River out here, which goes westward to Buffalo. And then this is the small Skyharry Creek. So some of the people, because there was just limited opportunity here, and there were only for so many people, started to move up right across here to the Skyharry Creek, and you can see they start making little tiny villages here. There's Hartmannsdorp. Now they're using German words, Brunendorp, North Blenheim, Oberweiserdorp. And they're starting to expand out from this settlement. one thing I should mention too, one of the ideas I mentioned this earlier, one of the ideas that the English had were that these people were there were a lot of pine trees in New York. And so they would cut the pine and turn it into pitch for English naval vessels. And this was at that time, the British were very dependent on the Russians and the Swedes for pitch. And of course, that made them very vulnerable to not have that production being done by themselves. So they had this great idea that, oh, these people are going to go over there. They're going to cut down these trees. We'll train them in how to turn this into pitch. What they found too late was that the pine trees in New York are not good for that. It's a different kind of pine tree than, say, exists in Georgia. The pine trees in Georgia are a totally different type, and they are very good for that purpose. The pine trees in New York are not good for that at all. So they produce some pitch, but the whole plan, the whole economic plan fell apart. And so now people were basically, after a few years, were basically told, you can go anywhere you want, just do whatever you have to do to survive. And so some of them stayed down here, not so much in West Camp, but people stayed over here on the eastern shore of the Hudson Valley. And some of them went down into Rhinebeck, which was now a village with some substance. And you could have people with trades, people like my ancestor became a tailor in Rhinebeck. Some took up farming, some started to move up this way a little bit, not quite yet. But they're basically, the idea was that they're all going to be working together. This again, this was the English plan, all going to be working together, and they'll be a great financial benefit to Great Britain. But like I said, once they reached that point, this is a total failure. Then they basically had to let them go. And there was a lot of discontent. Obviously, people were really, again, they've come from a terrible situation, had a terrible situation in London. Now they have a terrible situation here. So they started moving up the Skyharry Valley. Now, the English have no problem with this because, and this goes back to the other thing I mentioned, the idea that up here, not that far north, are the French. So the French are up in Canada, and there's almost no population in what's now northern New York at all, no population whatsoever. And so the British, rightfully were concerned that the French could easily just move right down the Hudson Valley into New York City, threaten New York City and Western New England. So the idea of having this buffer of, again, Protestants, it wouldn't have worked out quite that way. And the English sense of things, like, oh, you're going to be religious warfare. It's just that there would be a population of people loyal to the British, to sort of block the advance of the French. And in fact, almost just a couple of years after these people arrived, they actually formed militias, and there was actually a foray into French territory in northern New York. So that's another thing that very little has been written about, and I know a bit about it, but not a lot. The whole thing what happened there, that whole military excursion to sort of threaten the French, say, hey, we're here and don't come any further. So then after moving up the Skyharry Creek, then they hit the Mohawk River and they start moving out here into this area. So now I've got names like Herkimer, German Flats, Mannheim, Oppenheim, and they start settling all in this area. Now, an interesting thing is this area is already occupied by the Mohawks of the Iroquois Confederacy. And amazingly, they get along really well. In fact, it's been said that this was probably the most positive Indian-white relationship that existed in American history. I mean, it's at that level. They went to church together. A lot of the Mohawks had become Christians. They went to church together. They were sponsors at each other's children's baptisms. and they just cooperated very much. The Mohawks helped them to learn the nature of the land that they were dealing with, and the Germans were farming. And they didn't, interestingly, they did not intermarry. As close as they were, there was very little intermarriage between the two groups of people. And they also had another thing in common in that they all, at this point, hated the English. So they had that pulling them together as well. Now, things in the Mohawk Valley, you know, again, if you're farmers, one of the big issues is land and having enough land. And you did have this conflict again with the English in Albany. Now, this doesn't enter into too much of the scenario at this point, although it is something to consider. The political environment in New York at that time was very feudal, based very much in Albany. The Dutch had settled what were called patroonships, where all the land was owned by just a few families. The Schuylers, the Van Rensselaers, they owned massive amounts of land. I mean, like incomprehensible amounts of land. They owned everything. And there were a couple of English or Scots who sort of married into these families. One of them was Livingston. I should go back here to fully explain this. Oops, actually I can go to this one. Right down here, you see this word Livingston Manor. So Robert Livingston owned all this land and more. And so there were all these issues about land ownership because Livingston owned everything. And then up here, you had the Van Rensselaers and the Schuylers who owned, all this land was owned. It was all deeded to a handful of families. Now here you had a family called Duane who owned all this land. It was called and this continued after the Revolutionary War. It was like New York continued to be a feudal society in many ways after the Revolutionary War existed. So because there were these conflicts about land ownership and dealing with the English, and in limited land, again, for a large number of farmers now, people were unhappy here. And some of them moved down into Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania, I mentioned, had already had a strong German presence. And so this is up in northeastern Pennsylvania, roughly, Schuylkill, Schuylkill River, Lehigh, all these counties, Bucks, Chester, Lancaster, and Tulpehocken, here's this Tulpehocken Creek, was the name for the general name for the area. And so some of them came from the Mohawk Valley, and some of them came directly from the Hudson Valley and moved into this part of Pennsylvania. So all these communities were related to each other. Some of my Finkell relatives came down here. One interesting thing from a name point of view, my name was originally spelled Finckel. It generally became Finkle up in New York. But because these people moved into a very German-speaking environment, the Finkells in this area continued using the same spelling Finckel that they came with from Germany. And to this day, I have cousins who still use the original German spelling, but they came out of this Pennsylvania community. I heard a talk by the Lutheran pastor in Germantown one time, and he said that his family, of course, had always stayed in Germantown. So he said, we were very, passive, very accepting people. His wife was from the Tulpehocken community. So he said her family, of course, were not only the malcontents who went to the Mohawk Valley, they were the super malcontents who went to Pennsylvania, but they got along anyway. Now, in terms of what we know about these people, in terms of now looking at it from a genealogy point of view, what do we know about them? What can we find out about them? Well, Governor Hunter, because he had to provide supplies to these people. He was tasked with that. He was given a budget that, now that we look at it, was very inadequate. In fact, well, even he knew it was inadequate. So over each year, he would have a provision list of people who were getting provisions from him, which started out initially with literally everybody. Everyone was in that position. So this is just a sample page from one of his provision lists, and they're really excellent references for anyone doing genealogy. They give you the family, they give you the number of people in different age groups and so on. And you also get to see, and again, this is another thing in terms of looking at Hank Jones that uses this technique a lot to find out, well, where did they come from in Germany? Because as I said, they're coming from all sorts of different states at that point. So he actually would look at, okay, this person, here's one of the Fink, I forget which, I can't make that first name out, Flugler. He would actually look at, well, who is listed next to whom? Some of them are, of course, are alphabetical, but some of them, the original list were just taken as you got into a line, and they would take your name down and take the information. And so very often, of course, you get in line with someone you know. And very often the person you know has come from the same village or the same vicinity in Germany. So we actually use this very effectively to help find villages of origin for many of these people. Now, the other really important single source for this information is the Simmendinger list, Simmendinger register. Ulrich Simmendinger was one of the people who came here, with the group in 1710. He and his wife had a very difficult life here. They had 2 children. They lost both their children, during the time of the very bad starvation period. They moved to New York City. I think they went to Brooklyn. He documents all of this in the book, which is available online. It's a very interesting thing to read. They had a very hard time of it, and they finally just decided they wanted to go back to Germany, as bad as things were there. But what was amazing was he decided on his own that he would help bring news back to the families in Germany. And so he actually compiled a list of all the people, and to the extent that he could track them down. Some people, by the way, took off for parts unknown. I mean, I know before the meeting, I was saying that 2 famous descendants of these 1710 Germans, one is Elvis Presley, whose ancestor Valentin Bressler was with the group in 1710. Bressler morphed into Presley over time, and Tim McGraw, I don't know if anyone of you saw the Tim McGraw episode of Who Do You Think You Are years ago, but his ancestors were among this group. They left for Virginia early on. I mean, they just took off, and they didn't even follow the whole Mohawk Valley Tulpehocken path. And so anyone he could track down, he got their names, he got their husband and wife's name, number of children, and where they lived. And at this point, they had settled down in Germantown. Now they have little villages in the Germantown area, only now most of these villages have German names. And he compiled all this to bring it back to their relatives, to say, these people are still alive. This is where they're living, in these specific villages. So this is the English version, True and Authentic Register of Persons Still Living by God's Grace, who in the year 1709, under the wonderful providence of the Lord, journeyed from Germany to America or the New World. Interestingly, if you notice that he does use the word Germany. They wouldn't have been using the word Germany back in Germany at that point. And it says, and there to seek their piece of bread at various places. So this is one of a page, English translation, but it was set up in German in this fashion. And so you have the couple's name, and number of children they have, alphabetically arranged. And this is I'll show you this lower left corner, because this includes my ancestors. So you've got here Falkenberg, Follinger, and then there were several Finks who came at the same time: Franz Fink, Anna Margareta Fink, Andreas Fink, and Philip Finkell and Anna Katerina, my ancestors, with 3 children. And so at that point, this is my the youngest child at this point is my direct ancestor, Georg. So this is a tremendous resource for anyone doing genealogy. Now, Henry Z. Jones, who very much goes by Hank, he is the ultimate source of information for anyone with New York Palatine ancestry. And he wrote these books around the 1980s. And this is the group that specifically that came over here in 1710. And he worked with a woman in Germany over several years, to try to track down the ancestral village of every one of these people. He did not succeed. I mean, I forget the numbers involved, but he got more than 50% of the ancestral villages for these families. So he, in the book, for an entry for a particular family, you will see if he found where they were from, he would tell you what they knew about them in Germany, maybe their parents, what church they belonged to, and things such as that. And then for all of them, he actually carries out their genealogy out to the next, and sometimes the generation after that, the grandchildren of the original 1710. It's just an invaluable resource for anybody who has this kind of ancestry, and actually clears up a lot of confusion. Because of, I don't know, I'm sure all of you run into the same thing with everyone has the same first names, and is this Johann Sebastian of the uncle, or is it Johann Sebastian the nephew? This is really valuable in that regard. And then he, let me just go back here before I continue next. So he followed this up with another book called More Palatine Families of New York. And then he went and created a 3-volume book, which is called Even More Palatine Families of New York, which goes way into later periods in the 18th century. So I can't even imagine how many, in the thousands of families he tracks down from the New York Palatines. And that's what I was going to mention here. People continued to come to the Rhineland throughout the entire 18th century. And so Hank's last volume, 3-volume work of Even More includes one of my ancestral families. They're Kohlhammers, and they arrived here in the 1760s. And so they're included in his Even More Palatine families to New York. And again, he tries as much as possible to identify the village of origin. It's a little more abbreviated than the first book. Part of it is because you kind of lose some of these people later on. But nonetheless, a tremendous resource. And an important thing to know is that it almost became a bit, well, actually it did in effect become a business of ships bringing people from the Rhineland to North America in general, to New York specifically. There were actually shipping companies that was their business, just bringing these people over here. Some of them, there were total disasters, ships sinking, tremendous loss of life. I don't know how many people in this century died in coming across the Atlantic from the Rhineland. The reason that I say that it is until the Revolutionary War is that all of this immigration was being sponsored by the British. And once the Revolutionary War occurred, that connection was broken. And so there was no mechanism by which Germans could come to North America, except, a few people here and there, but certainly not on the level that had been going on for the entire century up to that point. It wasn't until into the 1800s that you start to see large scale immigration from Germany and other parts of, at that point, other parts of Germany into America in general. And so at this point, I had heard that the numbers who came here in the 1700s are a fraction of the numbers who came in the 1800s. However, because they had been here for several generations before the ones in the 1800s, the number of descendants of those two separate groups are almost identical at this point in the US. And that's it. Let me just stop sharing.
Okay, we do have a question in chat, at least
Sure.
one. Let's see here. So Kathleen, are you still here? Looks like maybe she's left.
No, I'm here.
Oh, here, there you okay, there you are. You want to ask your question?
Yep. I was just wondering on those plaques that of the name lists that were in, in East and West Camp. Where specifically are they located? I have a lot of family up who would be interested to know where to go look for those.
Well, the East Camp is now Germantown, New York. It's between Rhinebeck, New York, and Hudson. There's a city called Hudson, New York,
Okay.
and it's actually between those two. It's right on the river. They have a lot of plaques in the area. I showed you those 3 plaques. There's actually a plaque that shows you the exact landing or the exact spot where, well, they know the landing spot, but also where they actually set up camp, the actual East Camp, where that was located. Many of those families stayed there. There are still families to this day that were in that 1710 group who still live in Germantown. And one interesting thing about Germantown, one of the families that came later on in the 1700s was named Rockefeller. So there are a lot of Rockefellers, not all wealthy, who live in Germantown. West Camp, I should say, West Camp, people moved out of West Camp, it seems, rather quickly. I don't think the land lent itself to farming or anything as much as the east side of the river did. And so it was funny, my wife and I, about 2 years ago, were driving over there, and we thought maybe we can find, there were no signs to direct you, unlike East Camp in Germantown, there were no signs to direct you to the landing spot. So we thought, I wonder if we can find it. So we did find one little sign on the road that said, this was, West Camp. So we drove down this road, and it turned out it was private property, and there was no sign, there was no invitation to come see this place. We did drive onto it, and you could see how it was directly across the river from East Camp. You could see, because we know what East Camp looks like, you could see it as like a straight shot right across the river.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, the next thing I see is that Paul, you had a comment about a book. Would you like to mention that?
Yeah, that was the book that I found that had the pictures of those particular plaques for that area, and it brought up another piece of information. The community there in the Reading, Pennsylvania area.
Yes.
And one of my ancestors, Weisner, he was a very famous Indian translator for the group up in New York.
Yes.
And his parents just kicked him out of the house at an early age and said, go live with the Indians.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very odd, but what you said, it's kind of standard. They live together in happiness up there in New York.
That's right. And yeah, Conrad Weiser Jr., there was Conrad Weiser Sr., who led the group that went up into the Mohawk Valley. I didn't get into a lot of that detail. And Conrad, just as you said, Paul, they had Conrad Weiser Jr. as a child living with a Mohawk family. So he became obviously fluent in the Mohawk language. Then he led the group that went down into Tulpehocken. And just as you said, he was an incredible, basically ambassador from the United States government to the Iroquois people who lived in Pennsylvania at that time. And he was highly regarded both by the US government and by the Iroquois people, because he treated them very fairly and he negotiated, very good treaties between the two.
Yeah.
There's actually a farm there, Conrad Weiser Farm that I think it's the state of Pennsylvania has.
I've been there. It's a beautiful place, and they've got a lot of the, this is all prior to the American Revolution, but that's what I was looking for. And Conrad was one of the founders that actually put the cornerstone on the first building in Reading, Pennsylvania.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I'm not surprised.
He was the guy, and it was that name of that river, Shokulni or Shokulin or something.
Yes,
was the name.
Yes.
Yeah, it was the name of the Indian that he traveled with for 7 days, walking back and forth between New York and Pennsylvania.
Right.
And it's not a short walk. And
no,
they did it many times back.
Yeah, I mean that just as you said, that's a great distance. And to think that a whole group of people made that trek is really amazing.
But I appreciate everything you did today. This is great. I got some really good information, and it's going to get me starting to think about more of my ancestors in the New York area.
Oh, great.
I've got a bunch up there, but it's something new for me to think about, the Palatine group.
Oh, great. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And next, Pat, you had a question? She's unmuting.
Okay, you want to talk to me. I want to know where to find the original passenger list for the Palatines coming in. I have the transcriptions, but there's more on the original lists if I can find them. Or what I have is the registrations when they got to the colonies.
There are lists, and I found them. I don't have the website off the top of my head. Interestingly, the lists vary in terms of their content. I assume it must have been up to the ship's captain to decide what information to collect. There's one ship that has not only the head of the household, but also the spouse. Well, if it's a husband, obviously there were men who died en route, so the head of the household was a woman. But if you had the couple, it listed the husband's name, the wife's name, and the children's names. I think that's only one ship. The others often will just have the head of the household, whether a man or woman, and the number of other people in the family. I don't know off the top of my head where those are. I'll try to find that list and I could send it to Anne.
Okay.
If that'd be work.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. Is there any other questions? I don't see anything else in chat that are questions. Anybody else have anything they'd like to ask or discuss regarding this topic? Okay, well, thank you so much. We're going to stop recording shortly here, as soon as Werner does that.
This has been a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. If you're already a member, thank you. Your fees have been supporting these and other society activities. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining now. Go to dallasgenealogy.org and click on the membership tab.